Ahoy! This is Michaela from Team Retro, where we like retro games and we like the devices that bring them to us. And in this video, we're taking a second look at the Aya Neo Air 5600U model. Well, I found that the Windows experience with this device has been kind of lackluster. I've actually had a much more enjoyable experience using two different Linux-based operating systems with this device. The first one being JELOS, which I run off of the SD card, and I use this for all of my emulation purposes, so NES, SNES, anything that will run off RetroArch, as well as some light GameCube emulation using Dolphin. But then I also have a build of ChimeraOS running off of the main hard drive, which allows me to access all of my indie, light PC, and retro game collections that I have right in my Steam library. And while the Aya Neo Air is a beautiful device, especially with that 5.5-inch OLED screen, I have found myself struggling to try and enjoy this device because it does have several flaws, most notably the battery life, which has actually been somewhat mitigated by shedding Windows and going with these two Linux builds. And so let's put these two operating systems through their paces and see if we can give a second lease on life to an otherwise flawed yet beautiful handheld. So let's dive in and let's get to work. So let's go ahead and start with a quick tutorial on how to install JELOS onto an SD card. And that's as simple as navigating to their GitHub page and going to the Releases tab, and you're going to want to pick the JELOS release that specifically says Aya Neo GPD and other x86-64 devices. And then from there, you'll simply download the file. And once you have that downloaded and ready to go, you can use any imaging program like Raspberry Pi Imager, Balena Etcher, or Win32 Disk Imager in order to actually burn this image onto a micro SD card. Now, installing ChimeraOS is a little bit more involved, but I did a whole video on how to do that, and I also addressed some of the concerns I had with ChimeraOS that have since been addressed since I had made that video. So I'm going to talk about some of those updates a little bit later on. But if you need an install tutorial, I'll leave a link to my other video in the description. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you how I set up the dual boot. So we're actually going to go into the BIOS. We're going to hold the LC button, the volume up button, and the power button in order to turn on the unit. And after we push that power button, we're just going to keep holding the LC and volume up buttons until we get to the boot menu here. Now, it's a little bit small and it is in portrait mode. But if we use the Aya Neo button here, we can actually toggle through the different boot options. So we're actually going to go into Enter Setup, and that's going to take us to our BIOS. And just to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to go ahead and attach a USB keyboard to the USB-C port here on the bottom. And I'm going to use the arrow keys on that keyboard to navigate to my boot order. Now, This is unfortunately as zoomed in as I can get, so it might be a little bit hard to see. But if you go over into the boot order, you want to pick the first drive and you want to make sure you set that to your micro SD card and then set option 2 to the NVMe hard drive, which is going to contain Chimera OS. And then from there, you're going to simply navigate to save and exit, and the system will automatically reboot to the first option that we chose, which in this case is JELOS. Now, if you do take the SD card out for any reason, the system will default to using the internal hard drive as the first boot option, which will be Chimera OS. So if you do end up taking the SD card out, you are going to have to go back into the BIOS and set it as the default drive again if you want JELOS to be your primary boot. But for now, let's shut down the JELOS end and let me show you how you can boot into Chimera. So you're going to again turn on the system and you're going to hold the LC and volume up buttons at the same time so that you can get into that boot menu. And then from there, go ahead and use the INEO button to select the NVMe drive, and then it will boot you into Chimera, and you can use the volume up button to make sure that you actually boot into Chimera OS. And then just like that, you are in the Chimera OS menu, and it will download whatever updates it needs to, and then you will get a SteamOS interface and you'll be able to access your Steam library. So let me talk a little bit about why I like JELOS on an INEO device as opposed to Windows. And the developers did a very good job actually implementing native INEO controls right into the operating system itself. So let's start with the fact that you can change the LED brightness as well as the device LEDs themselves, and I have it set to a nice purple right now. And they also figured out how to get native fan control as well as TDP adjustments, and you could do this as an entire system basis, and you can also adjust these controls on a per game basis, just like you would when you're adjusting the emulators and aspect ratios and all that. You can handle it right from the JELOS menu. And so if we were to take Paper Mario the Thousand Year Door, we can actually go right into our game settings and we could set the emulator, we could set the cooling profile, the threads, we could set the TDP, and we can also set the native resolution. So we can set this to run at 1080p or 720p, depending on our use case. And I really enjoy that we could do this on a per game basis. So now let's go ahead and run some tests using Paper Mario the Thousand Year Door. And we're going to run this at a 3x resolution, 1080p. And there are a couple of things I like to do to test whether GameCube is going to work. One of them is to get the boat past the intro screen and get to this prologue, which we are able to do here in JELOS using the standalone Dolphin emulator. And we're running this at a 10-watt TDP, and so far so good. Let's move to the next GameCube test I like to run. And that's here in this part of the opening scene where the boat actually jumps up into the air and flips around. And as you can see, when the boat jumps up and flips, all of the graphics are maintained and there's no artifacting or any issues. And then the third test is right after the first battle, where a ton of minions come into the screen. And I know I'm going to have a bad time on a handheld device if these minions don't actually come in if you only see their shadows. But sure enough, they're all jumping in, they're all bouncing on top of each other, and the system is able to handle it without any frame rate drops. So you're going to find that the GameCube generation of games are going to actually work pretty well on the Jello side of the Ioneo Air. This is also a very good device for Game Boy Advance content. It runs the 3 by 2 aspect ratio pretty well with only minor black bars on the sides, and it doesn't seem stretched out, and you can run Game Boy Advance at a low TDP, and on this OLED screen, it just looks absolutely gorgeous. If Nintendo ever made an OLED GBA, this is what it would look like, and it's very impressive. Now, one of my biggest concerns with the Ioneo Air is the battery life. So let's go ahead and run a quick battery test at 50% brightness using a Super Nintendo game running at an 8-watt TDP. And I had to stop the test about 2 hours and 16 minutes in because I had to go pick up my son from daycare. But when I did stop it, the Ioneo Air had about 17% battery life left on it, which means that I probably could have pushed this closer to the 3 hour mark before the battery died. And these are already much more impressive results than when I was running Windows on this device. Now let's go ahead and check out the Chimera OS side. And one of the concerns I actually had about using Chimera OS on this device was that DekiLoader wasn't really loading plugins, but you could see here that I was actually able to get CSS Loader running and I was able to install a custom theme. Now there's also a new interface that allows you to control some of the settings on the Ioneo Air through SteamOS that you weren't able to actually do before. And once you get this menu up and running, you can adjust the TDP as well as enable or disable SMT, and you can adjust other power tools as necessary. And the native quick settings menu hasn't gone away either. It's just moved to the LC button here at the top, so you can still adjust your volume and your brightness and update your plugins. Now we're going to go ahead and do another battery test on the Chimera OS side, but this time we're going to test out Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, and we're going to test it at an 8-watt TDP because you're going to find that this is actually the sweet spot for indie and light games. And unfortunately, the results here were not as promising as when we ran a Super Nintendo game because at 50% brightness, the battery only lasted about an hour and 40 minutes. So that brings us just under the 2 hour mark. And so, if you plan on gaming on this device for longer play sessions, you're going to need a battery pack or a plug handy. However, let's move on to some retro PC games that you can enjoy sitting at this 8-watt TDP. And one of them is this odd little arcade game called Athena. Now, this is part of the SNK 40th Anniversary Collection. And when I bought this collection, I was very confused as to why there was this cartoon girl walking around with no clothes on. And come to find out that it's this game, and it's a little weird that it starts with her dress flying off when you fall into the first level. But once you get into it, you find that she actually finds hammer and sword upgrades. And It's a little creepy at first just because of the art style and choices they made, but the gameplay is actually fairly solid and enjoyable. Just SNK, what are you doing? Put clothes on your characters, please. There are also two Capcom Arcade Stadium collections on Steam, and these are two a la carte storefronts where you can either buy the entire bundle of arcade games or you can just pick and choose the ones you want at a lower price. And one of those games is a fun arcade shmup called Gigawing. And at an 8-watt TDP, you can see this game runs very well. I'm just not very good at shmups. Thankfully, I don't have to pay in quarters. I can just hit the select button and continue where I left off. And the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis Classics feature all three of the Streets of Rage games. So if you wanted to, if you bought this collection as well as Streets of Rage 4, your Steam library can have the entire Streets of Rage series. And to me, that's just about as cool as being able to get the Turtles Cowabunga collection and Shredder's Revenge and be able to have the entire Turtles series on your Steam account as well. And these all work with Steam Cloud. So if you have a Steam Deck, you can start on one device and go to another, or you can start on your PC and continue on this device. So I really like the versatility that the Steam Store brings with all of these new handhelds hitting the market. And one of the things I really like about this Genesis collection is how they simulated being a kid in the 80s by having all your games on the shelf and then actually physically taking the cart and plugging it into a CRT TV. It's just a nice little touch of nostalgia that they threw in. All right, so let's start to wrap things up with my second thoughts on this device with the dual boot JELOS and ChimeraOS. And my first point here is that this OLED screen is still absolutely gorgeous. And it's great for 4:3 content as well as Game Boy Advance. The aspect ratio does lend itself pretty well to 3:2 content, and I find that the OLED screen combined with the Game Boy Advance aspect ratio is just a pleasure on this device specifically. It's also very light and portable. It's one of the lightest handhelds out there. And you're going to get the best performance by running light gaming. So that's your 8 and 16-bit systems, as well as your lightweight PC indie games. And both operating systems have come a long way as far as being able to control and optimize the hardware, as well as get rid of some of that Windows bloat that may bog down the battery life as well as the performance of the device. However, I paid a lot for this device last year. I bought it on Amazon and I paid a pretty penny for it at the time. And while the price has gone down, it's still a pretty expensive device to play indie games and do light emulation on. And you still have to consider that price to performance ratio, especially considering that the battery life is probably not going to perform to your expectations. And so before I close out, let's do some price comparisons just in case you are interested in this device. So for reference, you can get the Neo Air for $649 right from Ioneo's website, and you'll find that the only models available are the 5600U 16 gigabytes of RAM with 512 gigabytes of storage in black, white, or pink. The lower models with 8 gigabytes of RAM are no longer available as of this recording. And if you go on Amazon, you can find the iNeo Air for about the same price, with the Pro model at $869, and then it kind of escalates from there. Now, at that price point, you can also order the AYN Loki, which is actually a more powerful device with a bigger battery and a slightly bigger screen, albeit it's not an OLED screen. And if you backed the AYN Odin, you actually can get $50 off of this device, making it more powerful and cheaper. And then if you want to go $50 higher, you can walk into a Best Buy and pick up the ROG Ally, and you'll get a much more powerful device with a 120 Hz refresh rate on the screen, and it's not that much heavier. In fact, ergonomically, this device feels really good with its weight distribution. And I did do an in-depth review on this device that I'll leave in the description in case you are considering this as an alternative. However, if battery efficiency as well as budget are your ultimate concerns, then we can't ignore the Steam Deck, coming in at only $400 for the 64GB model. However, you are definitely sacrificing some portability, as the Steam Deck is a much heavier device. However, it is also much more versatile in what it can do. And so if you already own this device, or you picked it up a little bit cheaper than what I showed you in this video, you're going to find that it is going to serve you very well as long as you can get past the battery life. But if you're in the market for a new handheld, even with giving this device a second chance, there is better out there, and I actually find myself reaching for the AYN Loki a lot more than I do this device. And I'll be explaining why when I do my full review on the AYN Loki coming up in a future video. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you have one of these devices or something comparable? And is this dual boot system something that you are willing to try, or that you've already tried? Or if you are passing on a device like this, what are you purchasing instead? And feel free to continue the conversation in both the Retro Handhelds Discord as well as the Steam Machine Discord. I am partnered with both communities, and I have a home in both of those servers, so I'd be happy to chat with you there about this device or any other device. As I record this, Caleb 2023 from the Retro Handhelds Discord community has already convinced me to buy a Pimax Portal, so I'm going to be covering that in a future video as well. But for now, that'll do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and if this was helpful to you in any way, please be sure to like and subscribe. Until next time, bye for now, and don't stop believing.